Welcome back to another day of living environment. We are now on to day 2 of biomolecules. Okay, so we're still in unit 2, but we've already wrapped up cells and now we are talking about biomolecules. So today's aim is how do cells use chemicals to maintain homeostasis? There are a few things you should annotate on this aim. So first, whenever you see the word cells, you should know that we're talking about the building blocks of life. Right? Whenever you see the word homeostasis, I told you guys would see it often. You should know that we're talking about maintaining a stable internal environment. And finally, in this case, when we're talking about chemicals, we're actually talking about those biomolecules. And today we're going to learn about 3 different examples of biomolecules. All right. So today's do now is, what is a carbohydrate? Go ahead and pause this video, answer that question, and then press play. So what is a carbohydrate? You may have heard this just abbreviated as carbs. So maybe one of your friends avoids carbs like the plague, right? But really, carbs aren't all that bad, because what do carbs do? Well, they give us energy. Okay, so what is a carbohydrate? It's basically, this is running into our aim. Maybe I should do this in a different color. Yeah, I'm gonna quickly write this in a different color. Please hold. All right, so carbs give us energy. So what are they? They're just sugar molecules. So carbohydrates are sugar. Okay, and they're made up of 3 different elements. They're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So I usually just abbreviate carbohydrates as CHO. So anytime you see a molecule that's made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1:2:1 ratio, it's going to be a carbohydrate. Okay, so let's move on to part A, our notes. You've got a definition here. This is an organism's ability, it's missing an apostrophe, to maintain a stable internal environment despite changes in the external environment. Now, call me crazy, but stable internal environment, I seem to recall those 3 words meaning a certain phrase such as homeostasis. So homeostasis is an organism's ability to maintain that stable internal environment despite changes outside. So we see this a lot with like temperature regulation, right? Our body is able to maintain a stable temperature despite changing conditions outside. So that's homeostasis. Now, what are the building blocks of life? So the parts of a cell are made up of large, complex molecules, often called biomolecules. Remember I told you in our last video that bio means life or living, and molecules is just talking about like components of, or compounds. So biomolecules are just compounds that make up living things. All right, these building blocks are made up of smaller, simpler pieces. And the third thing you need to write down is that biomolecules are organic. And when we say they're organic, this just means that they have carbon and hydrogen atoms. So if you are typing this in Google Docs, feel free to erase the line that I have provided for you. Just delete it and type in your answers. All right, so when we say the word organic, what do we mean? It just means that they contain carbon, which we abbreviate C, and hydrogen, which we abbreviate H. All right, the first building block of life that we're going to talk about is carbohydrates, which we talked about briefly yesterday, but we do need to dive a little bit more in detail. So what are carbohydrates? Well, they are molecules made of sugar. That's why they give us energy. specifically sugars, I guess I should say. So what is a sugar? Well, a sugar contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in the ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. I talked about this yesterday, but this does not mean that you're always going to have 1 carbon, 2 hydrogen, and 1 oxygen. Exactly, that's it. It's a ratio, which means that it can be any multiplication of that form. So for example, we have glucose, which is C6H12O6. That's still a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. But it has to be all 3 of these elements in that ratio of 1 to 2 to 1 in order to be considered a carbohydrate. All right, I just told you glucose is a common sugar found in grape juice, or really any sugary substance is probably going to have glucose in it. In fact, like if you're drinking any sodas, you might look on the back label and see like there's glucose or fructose, right? Those are all going to be examples of sugars. So glucose is a monosaccharide or a simple sugar. And I told you this yesterday, but mono, the prefix, actually means 1. So this really just means 1 sugar molecule. So if we were to draw this as a picture, we would just have 1 sugar molecule. So glucose is a really small sugar. And that will be very important later. Glucose is very, very small. But we also can join 2 sugars together to form what we call a disaccharide. So in this case, the prefix di means 2. So if we were to draw this as a picture, we would have 2 sugar molecules together. But once again, disaccharides are still pretty small. They're very simple sugars. However, things start to get pretty complicated when we start linking multiple sugar pieces together. And that's when we get what we call polysaccharides. So polysaccharides, the prefix poly means many. So in this case, we're talking about many sugar molecules. So if we were to draw this as a picture, it would be a long chain of sugar molecules. Now, because of this, polysaccharides are large sugars. And an example of a polysaccharide is going to be something called starch that we'll talk about in an upcoming lab. So starch is a really, really big sugar, but glucose is super tiny. But because polysaccharides are big and complex, they give us the most energy because they've got the most sugar packed inside that molecule. All right, so that's everything you need to know about carbohydrates. Next up, we've got to talk about something called lipids. So lipids are another class of biomolecules. And when we talk about lipids, we're really just talking about fats. So things like fats, phospholipids, steroids, waxes, those are all going to be examples of lipids. These are made from what we call glycerol and fatty acid chains. And the third thing you need to write down about lipids is their function. So the function of lipids is to store energy as fat. So they store that energy. That's why, like, if you are maybe packing on a few extra pounds like me, all of that fat is storing energy. It's extra sugar that your body hasn't used and is holding on to in case it needs it later. So the function is to store energy as fat. And it also controls water molecules. And we'll talk about this later when we talk about the cell membrane in a little bit more function, or in a little bit more detail. So stay tuned for that. I'll make some connections there. But the functions of lipids are to store energy as fat and control control water molecules. Okay, and the last thing we need to talk about is proteins. Now, I guess I actually need to retreat to lipids real quick and say most of my favorite foods are classified as lipids. So you can see in this picture right here, cheeseburgers, ice cream, cake, all of the best things in life are lipids. And I'm willing to go to war for that statement. All of the best things in life are lipids. It's really a shame that they're not good for us. All right, finally, last but not least, proteins are the third type of biomolecule. This is going to be found in things like meat, nuts, chicken, right? Chicken's meat, but all of that is going to be high in protein. And in fact, I think I remember a certain organelle that we talked about that starts with an R that produces proteins. All right, so proteins are created in the ribosomes. So proteins are actually a huge class of biomolecules because there are many different functions and types of proteins, and their function depends on the shape and size of that molecule. And we'll talk about this a lot, the function depending on size and shape, when we get to our topic of enzymes. So enzymes are proteins. And so because of that, there's a lot of specification in terms of their function, and we'll talk about that soon. So a protein is made up of what we call amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And finally, the last thing you need to write down for proteins is a long sentence, so I'm sorry in advance. But proteins, I actually had to write this down because there are so many of them. So they're used for several things. Hold on, proteins are used for movement, communication, we're almost done, transportation, and carrying out chemical reactions. All right. See, I knew I would forget one of those if I didn't write that down. So I had to write it down to make sure I got all of them for you. Proteins are used for structure, support, movement, communication, transportation, and carrying out chemical reactions. So proteins are super important, and we use them a lot. All right. We will talk more about these things in the upcoming days and weeks and really this entire year. But this is just to give you a foundation of that knowledge of those three types of biomolecules that we're going to be talking about. So now, using that information I just gave you, I do want you to complete this summary on your own. So using those notes, go ahead and fill in the rest of these blanks. So complex carbohydrates are used for what? Lipids store what? And then what are proteins used for? Fill in those three missing blanks. As always, complete that exit ticket to tell me what you know, and I hope you have a wonderful day.